The burn pile was behind Redfern apiaries on the gravel lot where the old commercial hives went once. Hollis Redfern had decided a box wasn't worth saving. Dana Marsh had been coming here for 4 days, not to buy. Redfern wasn't selling anything, he was liquidating. And liquidating meant everything left over went either to a competitor with cash or to the fire. But to listen, the way a person listens for something they are not yet allowed to call hope. She worked the same way each morning. She would kneel at a hive box, press her ear flat against the wood on the sunny side where any warmth left in the cluster would show first, and rap her knuckles twice against the side low, near where a winter cluster would have pulled together if there was one left to pull together. A dead hive answered with nothing. No sound at all, just the hollow give of an empty box. A hive that still had something alive inside it answered back, a low, rising hum, faint and irritated, the sound of thousands of bees braced against the cold and telling you, in the only language they had, that they had not finished yet. She had learned the knock test from a spiral notebook that had belonged to her grandfather, Earl Pruitt, who had kept bees in this same county for 41 years before arthritis took his hands, and grief took the rest of him after her grandmother died. Dana had inherited the notebook 18 months earlier, along with 4 acres of overgrown pasture behind her rented house, in the weeks after her divorce was finalized and she had moved back to Caldwell County with her 10-year-old son, and almost nothing else. Hollis Redfern's yard manager, a wiry man named Kurt Pruitt, no relation to her grandfather, a coincidence of names in a small county, had stopped asking why she came. He would nod at her from the loading dock and go back to stacking the boxes marked for burning. And she would work through the condemned rows, kneeling, listening, knocking, sorting the silent boxes from the ones that answered, marking the living ones with a strip of blue tape and setting them, one at a time, into the bed of her pickup. She had reached the 11th row that Thursday morning, in the thin gray light of early October, when Hollis came out of the office trailer with his coffee and saw the truck. Hollis had run Redfern apiaries for 26 years, 400 colonies at the operation's peak, before 3 consecutive years of mite pressure and a bad winter had collapsed him down to almost nothing. He was retiring the business, selling what equipment he could, and burning the rest because the state apiary inspector had told him informally that a yard this size going down this fast usually meant disease, and disease meant the safest thing for every other beekeeper in the county was fire. He looked at the truck bed now, at the taped boxes stacked too high under a moving blanket. He said, "Dana, what are you doing with those?" She said, "Testing them." He said, "Those are going in the burn barrel Saturday." She said, "I know. That's why I'm testing them first." Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. Dana Marsh had grown up on the far side of Caldwell County, in a house 2 miles from her grandfather Earl's, and had spent most of her childhood summers following him between hive rows, with a smoker she was too small to properly work and a veil that had never quite fit her face. She had married at 22, moved to Ohio for her husband's job, and spent the next 15 years mostly forgetting the bees, in the specific way a person forgets something they loved as a child without ever quite deciding to stop loving it. The divorce had come fast in the spring, after 15 years that had looked, from the outside, like they were fine. Dana had moved back to Caldwell County with her son Miles because it was the only place that still had family in it, into a rented farmhouse on 4 acres of pasture that belonged to her aunt and had gone to weeds since Earl's death 6 years earlier. She had almost no savings, a part-time job at the county clinic 3 days a week, and a level of quiet that she had not experienced since before her marriage and did not fully know what to do with. She had found her grandfather's notebooks in a box in her aunt's attic that September, 4 dog-eared composition books going back to 1979, filled with Earl's small, careful handwriting, hive counts, queen sources, mite treatments, honey yields by year, and here and there in the margins, the kind of observation a man writes down not because it's part of the record, but because he doesn't want to lose it. She had gone through the surface of the notebooks in the months right after his death, the last few seasons of neat, declining handwriting that recorded a man's slow retreat from an activity his hands could no longer manage. She had not read the older ones, the ones from the 80s and 90s, because reading them had felt like something she needed to be ready for, and it had taken her the better part of 6 years and 1 failed marriage to be ready. She found the entry that mattered in the 1994 volume, in a margin note beside a page about a bad winter that had taken most of his yard. Lost 30 of 40 to what looked like a hard kill. Everybody said pull the rest and burn it. Went back through before I did. 6 of the ones marked dead had a hum in them if you put your ear right on the box and knocked. Weren't dead. Were starved and queenless and about to be dead, which isn't the same thing. Fed them, requeened 3, combined the rest onto the survivors. Had 9 hives by spring instead of 10. Would have had none if I'd trusted my eyes over my ears. She read it 3 times. She had no way to ask her grandfather what exactly he'd combined, or how, or what he'd fed them through, because he had been gone 6 years, and the men who might have kept notes alongside his had mostly moved on or passed on themselves. What she had was the sentence. Weren't dead. Were starved and queenless and about to be dead, which isn't the same thing. She spent the rest of that fall and most of the winter reading everything she could find about colony collapse, winter cluster survival, and the difference between a colony that had truly died and one that was simply failing and hadn't finished failing yet, not the general beekeeping literature, most of which assumed a beginner starting from a healthy package, but the harder, more specific material on rescuing distressed colonies. She read about the newspaper combination method, about emergency winter feeding with fondant and dry sugar when syrup would chill a cluster rather than help it, about how long a queenless colony could survive on its own before the worker population aged out past the point where it could raise a replacement queen from existing eggs. She read about mite loads, about how 3 consecutive bad years compounded rather than simply repeated, each winter's survivors weaker going into the next. She read about American foul brood specifically and at length, because it was the one condition that genuinely justified burning. Its spores persisting in wood and wax for decades, capable of infecting every hive that ever touched the same equipment. And she was not going to bring anything home on the strength of hope alone. She read the State Extension's diagnostic guide until she could describe, without looking, the rope test for infected brood, the sunken and perforated cappings, the sour smell that gave the disease its old country name of foul brood in the first place. She was not going to guess. She had read for 3 months before she ever asked Hollis Redfern if she could go through the burn pile before Saturday. Hollis had said, "Sure, help yourself," though privately he thought she was wasting a cold week on boxes that were finished. The inspector had told him disease was likely. Hollis had no reason to disbelieve the inspector. Dana tested all 60 condemned hives over 4 mornings, kneeling in the gravel with her ear against the wood and her grandfather's notebook open on the ground beside her for reference. Of the 60, 41 gave back nothing at all. Hollow, silent, genuinely empty, the boxes light when she lifted a corner to check. No cluster, no weight, no sound. She left those for Hollis's fire without a second thought. 19 answered. A faint hum, low and irritated, the sound of a cluster that was still holding together against odds that had already taken most of its neighbors. She checked each of the 19 for the signs of foul brood her reading had taught her to look for before she loaded a single one into her truck. No rope test on any dead brood she found, no sour smell, no perforated cappings, nothing that matched the disease pattern. What she found instead in hive after hive was starvation and orphaned colonies, clusters that had run out of stored honey in a hard fall or that had lost their queen to age or an accident and hadn't been able to raise a new one before their worker population aged out past the point of no return. Bad management, bad luck, and 3 brutal winters back to back. Not disease. Hollis had been burning starving, queenless bees for years without checking, because checking took longer than burning, and nobody had told him there was a difference worth checking for. She wrote in the notebook, the same kind of composition book her grandfather had used for 41 years, October 9th. 60 condemned hives tested. 41 confirmed empty, no salvage. 19 show cluster activity on knock test. No foul brood indicators present in any of the 19. Starvation and queenlessness, not disease. Loading 19 for combination and feeding. Kurt Pruitt helped her load the 19 taped boxes into the truck that afternoon without being asked to and without Hollis's knowledge, because Kurt had grown up 2 farms over from Earl Pruitt and had, as a boy, followed him between hive rows the same way Dana once had. She built the winter yard on her aunt's 4 acres over the following week, on the south-facing slope behind the old barn, where the sun would hit earliest in the morning and the wind would be cut by the tree line. She set the 19 boxes on cinder blocks off the wet ground and began the work her grandfather's margin note had described in 4 short sentences, and that took her most of the winter to actually carry out. She combined the weakest clusters using the newspaper method, stacking a struggling queenless colony over a stronger one, separated by a single sheet of newspaper with a few slits cut in it, so the 2 populations would chew through slowly and merge their scent over several days instead of fighting outright the way they would if combined too fast. She fed every surviving colony a heavy sugar syrup through what remained of the fall and switched to a dry sugar and pollen patty feed once the temperatures dropped too low for syrup to be safely taken up. She ordered 3 mated queens from a breeder in Georgia for the colonies that had no queen and no eggs young enough to raise their own, and introduced each one slowly, in a small cage the workers had to chew through over 3 days. So the colony would accept her scent rather than kill her as an intruder. By the 2nd week of November, the 19 salvaged colonies had become, through combination, 11 distinct hives, smaller than a healthy commercial count, but each one queen-right, each one fed. Each one, when she knocked on the box in the cold morning air, answering back with the low, steady hum of a cluster that intended to make it through winter. Word of what Dana was doing reached the feed store in Caldwell before she had finished combining the first 6 hives. Kurt had mentioned it, offhand, to a man named Gary Loomis who delivered fence posts and stopped in most mornings for coffee. Gary told Phil Danvers, who ran the register, that Dana Marsh had hauled off a truckload of Redfern's condemned hives and was out on her aunt's place every day in a bee veil trying to save them. Phil said, "Save them from what?" Gary said, "From being dead, I guess." Phil said, "Hollis said those were diseased. That's why he was burning them." Gary said, "That's what I heard too." The next customer, a woman named Louise Petrie, who kept a dozen backyard hives of her own and bought her sugar in bulk from the feed store every fall, had heard a different version that had accumulated between Gary's account and her own arrival. The version she had was that Dana had taken all 60 of Redfern's condemned hives, not 19, and was setting up a diseased yard 2 miles from 3 working apiaries without telling anyone. Louise said, "All 60. Phil said, "That's not what Gary said." Louise said, "That's what I heard at church." Phil said, "Deceased?" Louise said, "That's what Hollis's inspector told him." Phil and Louise looked at each other for a moment. Phil said, "That seems like something the association ought to know about." Louise agreed that it did. By noon, the story had traveled the way stories travel in a county with 1 feed store and 1 diner, which is quickly, and by the following week, it had settled into something closer to alarm than curiosity. What was accurate? Dana Marsh had taken condemned hives from the Redfern burn pile. What had drifted? The number, the disease status, and the degree of certainty with which people repeated a claim that had started as an informal, unverified remark from an inspector who had never opened a single one of the boxes individually. Hollis Redfern's own hives had failed for 3 years running. Everyone knew that. If Dana Marsh was taking home the ones he'd condemned as diseased and setting them up on open ground 2 miles from 3 other working apiaries in the county, some people thought she was risking everyone's bees for the sake of her own sentimentality about her dead grandfather. A man named Wade Ostrander, who kept 40 hives of his own on the ridge above Caldwell, and had served 2 terms as president of the County Beekeepers Association, drove out to the pasture on a Saturday in mid-November and stood at the fence looking at the row of cinder block hive stands. He said, "Dana, I heard you took Redfern's burn pile." She said, "The ones that tested alive." "Not the burn pile," he said. "Hollis's inspector called that yard diseased." She said, "The inspector called it likely disease informally, without testing every hive individually. I tested everyone before I brought a single box home. No foul brood in any of them. Starvation and queenlessness." He said, "You're not a certified inspector." She said, "No, but I know what foul brood smells like, and I know what a rope test looks like, and I checked for both in all 19 before I loaded them." He said, "If you're wrong, you could infect every hive in this county, including mine." She said, "If I'm wrong, I'll have the state inspector out here before I let a single frame near another apiary. I'm not asking anyone to take my word for it forever. I'm asking for the time it takes to find out." He looked at the cinder block row a long moment, at the taped and rebuilt boxes, at a woman in a veil with a smoker in one hand and a spiral notebook tucked under her arm. He said, "I hope you're right, for your sake and everybody else's." He drove off and told the story at the association's December meeting the way he'd seen it, which the room, mostly received as confirmation that Dana Marsh had taken an unnecessary risk on sentiment rather than sense. Dana called the state apiary inspector's office herself the following Monday, before anyone could call it in as a complaint first. An inspector named Renata Kowalczyk drove out on a Wednesday in early December. A woman in her 50s with the unhurried, exacting manner of someone who had opened several thousand hives over a long career and had learned not to conclude anything before the frames were actually out and in the light. She opened all 11 combined colonies, frame by frame, checking brood pattern, checking cappings, checking for the telltale rope and smell of American foul brood in every cell that looked remotely suspect. It took most of the afternoon. She worked in the cold with her hive tool and her own gloves, pulling every frame in every box regardless of how the first few frames looked, because a partial inspection was not an inspection. It was a guess with a clipboard attached to it. Dana stood beside her the whole time, taking her own notes, watching where Renata's attention went and what she was checking for. Renata said, at one point holding a frame up to the light, "This one had a rough patch, brood pattern spotty here," Dana said. "That's the third combination, the one I united latest first week of November. I wondered about that one myself." Renata looked at it a while longer and said it was consistent with a young, still settling queen rather than disease, and that she'd want to see it again in the spring to be sure, but that nothing about it met the criteria she was trained to look for. When she was done, she pulled off her gloves and said, "These are clean. Every one of them. What you're looking at is starvation recovery and combination, not disease." Dana said, "That's what I found too." Renata said, "You did the rope test yourself before you brought them home?" Dana said, "On every hive that showed any dead brood at all. I wasn't going to guess on something that could cost other people their bees." Renata looked at the notebook Dana was holding, the same one that had belonged to her grandfather, now with Dana's handwriting filling the pages after his. She said, "Where'd you learn the knock test?" "Most people don't know to check a supposedly dead hive before they write it off," Dana said. "My grandfather wrote it down in 1994 after a winter that took 30 of his 40 hives. I found the note 18 months ago in a box in my aunt's attic. In the same year, my own life came apart enough that I needed something to put back together." Renata wrote her clean inspection into the county record and told Wade Ostrander herself, at his own request, that the Marsh yard had passed a full frame-by-frame inspection with no disease present. Wade did not come back out to the fence to say anything about it directly. His wife mentioned at church the following Sunday that Wade had gone quiet after hearing the inspection results and had spent an afternoon out at his own bee yard with a notebook of his own, checking hives he'd written off 2 winters earlier without ever going back to look. The 11 colonies came through winter at 10. Dana lost one small combination hive in a February cold snap that dropped low enough, long enough to kill even a fed and queen right cluster if it was still building its numbers. She wrote the loss down plainly, the way her grandfather had written his losses down without softening it. 10 remained. She split 4 of the strongest in April, once the dandelion flow started and the population had built enough to spare a split without weakening the parent hive, bringing the count to 14 distinct colonies going into the first full working season. The first honey flow came in June, from the clover and locust that grew wild along the fence lines of a county that had more pasture than row crop. Dana pulled her first supers in the second week of July, 14 colonies worth, working the extraction in her aunt's barn with a hand crank extractor she'd bought secondhand and cleaned for 2 full days before she'd trust it near food. She got out 310 pounds of honey from 14 colonies that had started 8 months earlier as 19 boxes on a burn pile that the whole county believed were diseased. A man named Tom Brancato, who ran a small craft brewery in the county seat and had been buying local honey in 5-gallon buckets from 3 different beekeepers for 2 years to make a seasonal braggot, drove out in August after Phil Danvers at the feed store mentioned, almost as an aside while ringing up a fence post order, that the Marsh honey had a wildflower depth to it, that the commercial stuff Tom had been buying didn't have. Tom walked the yard with Dana, tasted honey straight from 3 different hives with 3 different comb colors, and asked how she'd started the operation. She told him. He said, "You built this out of Redfern's burn pile." She said, 19 hives that tested alive out of 60 that everyone had already written off. He said, "And the county association thought you were risking disease." She said, "Some of them did, until the state inspector came out and cleared every hive personally." He said, "That's a story people will taste in a glass if you let me put it on the label." He wrote out a standing order, his full honey volume for the braggot line, plus a second seasonal mead he was developing, with room to expand if her flock kept growing the way it had in one season. He said, 2 other breweries in the valley had been asking him where he sourced his honey, and he'd be glad to send them her way if she had the volume to spare. She said, "I'll have 22 hives by next season if the splits hold. That's more honey than I can move through the farmer's market alone." He said, 22 hives from 19 that were headed for a burn barrel. She said, from 60 that were headed for a burn barrel. 19 were the ones that answered back. He asked how she'd known which ones to check, and she told him about the notebook, and the margin note, and the knock test, and he wrote some of it down himself, on a napkin, because he said it was the kind of thing that belonged on the label copy, not just in conversation. 2 weeks later, a woman named Priya Okafor, who brewed a small batch honey wheat at a tap room 40 minutes north, called Dana directly after Tom had passed along her number, and drove down the following Saturday to taste the honey and see the yard for herself. She signed a smaller standing order on the spot for a lighter varietal Dana pulled mostly from the locust bloom, and said she'd take more the following year if the flock kept expanding. Hollis Redfern drove out to the pasture himself in September of the following year, a full season after he'd stood in his own yard and watched Dana Marsh load taped boxes into her truck bed. The 14 hives had become 22 by then through splits and one more successful combination of a weak swarm she'd caught off a neighbor's tree in June. He sat in his truck at the fence for a while before he got out. He said, "Dana." She said, "Hollis." He looked at the rows of hives, painted now, each one lettered with a queen date in Dana's careful hand, the way her grandfather had once lettered his own. He said, "I burned 400 hives over 3 winters, and never once knocked on a box before I put it on the pile." She said, "You were working from what the inspector told you, informally, about a whole yard." "I checked every box one at a time," he said. "I threw away a producing apiary." She said, "You threw away hives that looked finished." "I listened before I decided they were." He looked at the rows a while longer. He said, "Kurt tells me you're selling to 3 breweries now." She said, Tom Brancato and 2 others he introduced me to. I signed the 3rd contract in July. He said, "I've still got the extraction equipment from the old operation, sitting in a shed doing nothing. I was going to scrap it with everything else." She said, "I'd rather buy it from you than watch it go to scrap if the price is fair." He named a number that was less than the equipment was worth and told her so himself. He said, "Call it interest on 19 hives. I should have checked myself." Miles, 12 now, had taken to helping his mother most weekend mornings, suited up in a veil 2 sizes too big, learning to read a frame the way Dana had once learned from Earl 2 decades earlier and 40 acres over. A neighbor's younger daughter, maybe 7, had taken to watching the bee yard from the fence line for most of that second summer and came to the gate one Sunday before the fall honey pull with a question asked the way children ask things without any preamble at all. She said, "Why do the bees stay here?" "My dad says most of them died before you got them." Dana crouched to the child's level. She said, "They didn't all die. Some of them were just starving and had nobody to help them, and everybody had already decided they were finished before anybody checked." I checked. The child looked at the rows of hives, the steady drift of bees moving between them in the September light. She said, "How did you know which ones to check?" Dana said, "My grandfather wrote it down in 1994, 30 years before I needed to read it. I found the note in an old notebook after my own life fell apart enough that I had time to finally read it slowly." The child thought about this. She said, "It's loud." Dana listened. The hum of the yard steady and full, 22 hives working the last of the fall flow. She said, "Yes, it is." That night, after Miles had gone up to the house and the yard had gone quiet under a September evening, Dana sat at the kitchen table with the notebook, now in its 2nd volume of her own handwriting stacked beneath her grandfather's 4, and wrote the entry the way she wrote every entry, without embellishment. September! 22 hives, 2nd season. 3 brewery contracts signed. State inspection clean on file. 310 pounds first-year honey, projected over 600 this year. Cost of the original 19 hives, nothing. Cost of the winter it took to save them, everything I had left after the divorce. She read the line back to herself. Then she wrote one more. Started with 60 hives everyone called a lost cause. 19 had a hum in them if you knocked. 14 made it to spring. That was enough. She closed the notebook and set it on the shelf beside her grandfather's, the place in the house where things got written down for whoever came next. Then she went out to check the last row before dark. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told that what they're holding on to is already finished. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever listened closely enough to hear something everyone else had already declared silent, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read.